Well, it's finally here, the long-awaited finale to Rocksteady's Arkham series with Suicide Squad, a game which will undoubtedly treat the franchise with the kind of respect and gravitas that it deserves.
You stupid!
A series known for its flowing melee combat, vibrant environments to explore, and its love and attention to detail towards its source material. So yeah, what a great idea it was to turn it into a flashy third-person shooter with a completely different cast of characters, who are all introduced to kill off the series, literally and metaphorically.
Task Force X, your new mission is to kill the Justice League.
Yeah, so you probably already heard by now, but Suicide Squad isn't very good. It's a masterclass on how to not design a combat loop, featuring some of the absolute worst visual clutter I think I've ever seen in a video game, along with serving as a treatise on how to absolutely ruin the dynasty of one of gaming's most beloved characters and franchises.
Don't sweat it. Batman doesn't kill people.
The whole thing takes place a few years after Arkham Knight, and the premise is that supervillain and all-around arse-white Brainiac has invaded Earth, setting up shop in Metropolis and brainwashing the members of the Justice League.
I'm in the middle of a recon for Brainiac. Let's walk and talk.
Having already successfully turned Green Lantern, Superman, and Batman. To make matters worse, the Flash is also captured early on in the game too, with Wonder Woman being the only one able to evade capture, but she's off on the side there doing her own thing.
This is a hall for heroes, not you.
So apparently the best course of action to deal with the very likely outcome of global annihilation is for Amanda Waller to get the band back together and stop Brainiac's plans. Which means forming a team comprised of a giant man shark, a girl with daddy issues, an edgelord in a knockoff Deathstroke costume, and an Australian.
Kangaroo looking ass.
Because you are Australian.
The first 20 or 30 minutes of the game is a bit of a prologue showing how all of these guys get banded together, and then showing them getting suited up and how they end up in Metropolis to take on this mammoth task.
You know, that's just what I was gonna say.
And I mean, in all fairness, like, it's not the worst characters they could have used. If nothing else, King Shark, Harley, Boomerang, and Deadshot are kinda well established, even for people who aren't really into the comics, like myself. Still though, the concept of these guys somehow being able to take down the Justice League is completely laughable. And that's a problem because it's the whole point of the story. You know, in case the title of the game wasn't clue enough.
Ah, brilliant.
You'll work alongside familiar faces as well, like a reimagined Poison Ivy and the Penguin, who craft upgrades and weapons for you along the way.
It's your lucky day.
With the whole base of operations being set up inside the former Hall of Justice.
I've seen it on TV. It's the Hall of Justice.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
And there's going to be a whole lot of people talking trash about the writing and the premise, and to be honest, a lot of that stuff's going to be true. But I gotta say that even still, like, I was surprised at how much the game actually made me laugh at times.
The fastest man alive, according to all these girlfriends.
Because despite all the bad stuff, and there's a whole lot of bad stuff, there's still some genuinely funny character moments here and there. A big part of which comes from the character modelling and the animations, which really has to be some of the absolute best stuff I've seen in recent memory. And some of the facial expressions the characters show off during cinematics forms a big part of that humour. Reminds me of watching the Naked Gun movies when you'd get those reaction shots of people looking around the room awkwardly after Leslie Nielsen said something out of left field.
Cuban?
No, Dutch-Irish. My father was from Wales.
Harley isn't even as remotely annoying as I expected her to be either, and it even addresses her history a few times as well, where she directly references events from the Arkham games and how she's had to deal with all that stuff over time.
Once a promising young psychiatrist, she returned to the asylum to terrorize it as Joker's sidekick.
Every gal has a phase they regret.
Waller's played by Deborah Wilson, who I think at this point has basically been scanned into every single video game ever made. And she plays a pretty good version of Waller too, being this stone cold badass bitch who's gonna do anything she can for the so-called greater good.
This is a microbomb injector from our friends at LexCorp. Stick it in your target's neck, and it's good night.
Ooh, I like her.
I even found Boomerang to be a funny guy at times, which really is at odds with the second-hand cringe I often get in most other video games, where there's an Australian character who almost always comes across as an absolute moron.
Pow! Ha ha! Payback, you little shit.
But it's not the way the game handles this main cast that's gonna piss people off. Instead, that's really gonna come from the way that it handles the Justice League.
These resistors just don't respect martial law.
I do want to say though that the premise is at least interesting, even if the whole what if Superman was evil thing has been done to death. But I mean still man, seeing these iconic heroes brainwashed and acting like total dickbags was at least different enough to keep me intrigued. The way they introduced Batman was actually kind of awesome. It's like a sequence early on here where you're in a museum and the power's gone out, and Batman's taking out the members of the squad one by one, even outright toying with them along the way. And what's basically going on here is that you're seeing what it would look like during the Predator mode from the Arkham games if you were seeing it from the perspective of someone Batman was hunting. There's even a joke in there somewhere where Harley mentions that people should avoid standing under gargoyles.
My guys picked off one by one. This is all feeling real familiar.
So they knew what they were doing here, and it kinda works, as a fun, self-aware way of introducing the guy and establishing just how much of a badass he is. But then it's like they just don't know where to take him from there, and despite the squad royally messing Brainiac's operations up, we don't even see him until the second and final time, which is when you have to fight him. And it's like about all they can muster up there is just recycling the same idea all over again. That is, avoiding Batman in a pitch black area. Yeah, emphasis on pitch black. Before a metaphorical boss fight, which is absolutely awful. As for the fights against the other members, well, that just comes across as kinda lazy writing. And it always comes down to the squad conveniently finding some kind of gadget that's somehow able to weaken that Justice League member just long enough for them to dish out a bit of damage.
The device will allow you to destabilize his constructs and render Lantern vulnerable to attack.
Whoa, slow down, egghead.
Which explains, I guess, why they become suddenly vulnerable to bullets and makes them stand still for 5 seconds at a time. At least for the Flash and the Green Lantern anyway. As for the Superman fight, well, let me just say I hope you're not going to try and beat that with a controller. Overall, the story just really comes across like bad fanfiction, man, really pissing in the faces of all these beloved characters, and forcing us to watch them act and ultimately get treated like shit without any real resolution. These are the absolute worst possible versions of the Flash, the Green Lantern, Batman, and Superman, and they all go to their deaths here without ever really reconciling for their actions. I don't know, the whole thing just left me feeling super miserable. And I don't think it was the premise itself, it's just the way they've handled it, which could have been a damn sight better. Maybe they'll resolve that in the upcoming DLC, because Lord knows, man, they've got enough of that stuff already planned.
Get him!
Now, as for the gameplay, you'll be completing various missions for Warlight and the Argus organization, and Metropolis is a big city, man, which means getting around it's going to take a bit of time, with each member of the squad having their own means of traversal to instantly set them apart. Harley, for instance, controls the most like the other Arkham games, using a combination of a grappling hook to pull herself up to the side of buildings, along with being able to swing from a combat drone that hovers in the air. Deadshot, on the other hand, has got a handy jetpack, which really gives you complete autonomy of movement, you know, as long as it's got enough charge. But then you can also cheat your way into a second wind with this thing to propel yourself that little bit further, before finally needing to touch grass, literally, to reset it.
Hadn't really thought about that.
Boomerang, however, is probably the clunkiest one out of all 4, using some kind of ghetto Speed Force tech which teleports him short distances. Which is cool, but it also feels kinda clunky, zipping you ahead in short bursts as opposed to feeling like the fluid movement that the others have. And it's specifically for that reason that I think Shark is the most fun in that regard, because controlling this guy is basically like playing those old Incredible Hulk games, where you can make these massive leaps to clear large distances, along with running up the side of buildings and slamming into the ground with your fists.
Surf's up!
I just found him to be the most fun to play in general, and there's just something about a guy built like Haku the wrestler, with a shark for a head and a fast-firing minigun that's universally enjoyable to play as. The prologue sequence early on, I guess, is supposed to help you decide which character you want to play as, but if you're playing solo, you can swap out to another member at any time, assuming you're not in the middle of a mission.
You got something.
And what I quickly started to realize is that outside of the traversal, there's really not that much of a difference between any of these characters during combat. This is on the surface just a pretty basic third-person shooter where you run around, slide, jump, aim down sights, and shoot and throw grenades. certain characters can only equip certain weapons, but the actual combat loop is always going to be the same, regardless of who you're playing as. You just shoot enemies with whatever gun you've got when they're at a distance, and when they're close enough, you can melee them.
Keep the baddies from blocking me.
A melee attack is often going to knock an enemy up into the air, which then sets them up to be air juggled with your ranged weapon. And that's about it. I mean, there's no combos or unlockable moves like we had in the Arkham games. It's all just replaced with a pretty generic third-person shooter. And one too that even lacks all the other basic features you'd expect in a modern shooter. You know, like being able to take cover, for instance. Because yeah, man, it's not like in a game set outside in a massive city where you get attacked from all angles that you'd ever want to take cover, is it? That was sarcasm. The only real depth to the melee combat is that enemies with shields or armor have to be meleeed first before you can actually damage them. And certain enemy attacks can be countered, which is made extremely clear by a giant icon that flashes up on the screen. And speaking of shields, Suicide Squad has a really weird way of handling this too. Because the main way to get your shield back is to shoot an enemy in the legs in the hope of stunning them. At which point it leaves them open for a shield harvest, which is kind of like the glory kills in Doom Eternal. Where at which point if you melee them again, they're going to drop pickups to refill your shield. Only this can be really problematic during combat, especially if enemies are teleporting and shifting all over the place. Or just if the other squad members are killing them before you've even had the chance. Honestly, it's just such a weird mechanic, and in any other game, they would have just added in regenerating shields and called it a day. So I think the real reason they've done it is just to put it into play for the boss fights. Because in those moments, it forces you to actually use your counterattacks and learn their patterns. And during those moments, that's the only way to get your shields back.
Seriously?
Otherwise, you could have just run away for 10 seconds to get a full recharge, which would have totally removed any challenge those battles had. All up though, when it comes to the combat mechanics, I mean, that's about as deep as it gets. And I feel like once you've played for 20 minutes, you'll have pretty much seen all there is and got the gist of it.
Got the gist.
And I can't help but think too that this really would have worked well as a single player game, with each member having their own strengths and unique abilities. Like maybe you'd have to swap out to Shark for the tougher, brute enemies for instance, and then back to Deadshot to deal with the snipers. Be like in Grand Theft Auto 5, you know, you'd play the driving missions as Franklin and leave all the shooting to Michael and Trevor. Each character has their own skill tree, which is just this messy wall of graphics and meaningless text. And despite all these numbers and percentages looking quite complex, all of these characters share the same exact basic skills, with each of them getting a traversal kill which wipes out enemies in a small area. Along with a suicide strike, which is a focused, powerful attack against a single enemy. And yeah, like the animation might differ for each character, but it's still the exact same move regardless of who you're playing as. Even the so-called Squad Ultimate, which I still haven't unlocked, is the exact same for each member. They do introduce grenades at one point, and you can eventually unlock afflictions, which are elemental effects like ice and poison that can be applied to a bunch of enemies at once. But again, like every single squad member gets the same tools, so what's the point?
Seriously?
I mean, look, overall there's nothing bad with this stuff, and it functions mechanically how it's supposed to, you know, like 99% of the time. I never had any serious bugs or issues with hit detection, and the combat works as it's supposed to. But it really is an absolute example of style over substance. And no matter how many flashy effects they cram onto the screen, it's not gonna cover that up.
What's your last task force, Diane?
Don't look yet! I already did! No, I won't!
Eventually they start adding in all these tougher enemies, kind of, but you still deal with these more or less the exact same way. And the tactics which overcome the game's weaker enemy types still works against the bigger, tougher ones you're going to see in the endgame. I will say one thing though, and that's that in the game's defense, it does run amazingly well. Once I messed around with the settings a bit and tweaked things, I was able to get it running at 144 FPS on the maxed out settings without it ever really dipping, even during moments of utter chaos. As for the city itself, well, yeah, it looks decent enough, I guess, and the whole futuristic Art Deco vibe Metropolis has got going on makes for an interesting backdrop. I will say though that the time of day and the weather can greatly affect how the city looks, with it even genuinely looking last gen during certain conditions. Plus it's also completely devoid of any activity, with only the odd enemy patrols really offering up anything interesting. But presentation wise overall, it's definitely pretty decent. And yeah, I know we shouldn't be praising developers for making sure a game runs smoothly, but the optimization is definitely worth mentioning. The problem though is just with the insane amount of visual clutter, which really brings the whole thing down. And the amount of stuff popping up on the screen here, it has to break some kind of record. I mean, it seems every single inch of the screen just has some kind of information overlaid. Be it health or damage numbers, counter flashes, an ability, power bar or meter that's filling up, along with like a dozen explosions and other visual effects. It's like the scene at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey when Dave gets pulled through that vortex and starts tripping balls.
Pick up every hand of theirs. Got it in yours. Huh? Penguin said you?
And this stuff is bad enough when you're playing solo. I can't even imagine what it's going to be like when you're playing with 3 other people. One of the first encounters against the Flash, I'm certain, is going to induce seizures in at least one person. It's like being stuck inside a tumble dryer while you're dosed up on LSD. The enemy count during some of these missions has to be in the dozens, and with all of these guys being on different rooftops, on the street level, and then climbing up the side of buildings, it just makes it absolute pandemonium. It honestly reminded me of playing Prototype back on the PS3, where you'd be in that similar large city environment where all hell was breaking loose, and that's what it really does feel like here, man, just this barrage of elements all at once. Harkens back to what I said earlier too about playing this with a controller, and I genuinely can't imagine trying to play through this without a mouse and a keyboard, because the erratic movement of some of the enemy types is hard enough to track as it is, let alone trying to do that with thumbsticks. Despite all of that though, I didn't really find Suicide Squad all that challenging, outside of a few moments here and there, and if you're playing solo, like I did, the AI seems to be capable enough to lend a helping hand without ever really stealing your thunder. I do find it really odd though how the game's clearly been designed around co-op play, but then it also seems to encourage playing solo, with certain squad members favouring certain missions, at which point swapping out to plays them is going to net you more XP than the others.
Unless y'all want to end up a poorly plated spring mix, you better put me in charge and let me talk to Ives first.
But then even when you're playing solo, it has all the worst components of a live service game. That being this ridiculously tedious mission complete screen you have to sit through every single time you finish one, which just feels so out of place when you're playing solo.
Such power is best left with me.
Along with, of course, the fact that the game is always online, meaning you're at the mercy of the server as to if you're even going to be able to play in the first place.
More firepower and aspirational power.
And what I found the weirdest though is that you can't even change your gear during a mission.
Come again.
Which is just this incredibly bizarre mechanic. So if you're stuck in a fight, for instance, and don't have the best weapon, shield, or grenade for the job, well, then I'm sorry to say, man, but you're basically fucked. I was in a situation where I'd basically brought a shotgun to an assault rifle fight, if that makes sense, and I didn't even have the basic convenience of being able to rectify this. So what it basically meant was that I had to accept my defeat, quit out to the main menu, just so I could modify my loadout. And then of course, because this is an online game, the best it could do was restart me at the beginning of that entire fucking mission. You know, from 20 minutes prior, because apparently checkpoints don't exist either. And I gotta say, like, I genuinely cannot think of a single other game that has this limitation. Outside of taking down the Justice League, you gotta complete a whole bunch of missions speckled across the city, and a lot of these are just the same 2 or 3 formats repeated over and over. Like one where you've got to destroy a bunch of incubators.
Quickly, exploit this incubator's weakness.
There's another one where you need to charge up these energy pulses by collecting essence left from fallen enemies.
Almost there, TFX. Jammer's just off capacity.
Or how about this banger here, man, where you've got to escort a slowly moving vehicle through town, which feels like something out of an old PS3 game. It's actually kind of funny to say that, because I remember that Infamous on the PlayStation 3 had a bunch of missions like this one too, and it's the same kind of thing again here, where they needlessly drive like they're stuck in first gear. Another common one is where you'll need to evacuate civilians from a hostile area, firstly by clearing the bad guys away and then carrying them back to a nearby bus for extraction. The way the game tries to mix these up is by adding in these bizarre limitations to the combat. Like, they might make it so you can only damage enemies through critical hits, or that the enemies can only be damaged when they're afflicted. Which really though is just a bit of a means to hide the fact that they're repeating the same missions over and over. Then once you've dealt with all of the Justice League, the final component of the game is taken on Brainiac. But then you can only do this after grinding for a specific resource named Promethium that then allows you to travel to the universe that one of his iterations is hiding in. And you do this by, yet again, completing more side missions across the city. And then when you've got enough of that stuff, you can travel through the multiverse to kill off one iteration of Brainiac, with there apparently being 13 in total. And what is he, Doctor Who or something?
Good job taking out the trash, TFX.
Keep in mind as well that this was only after 12 hours of game time, which more or less means that in half a day I'd managed to kill 3 metahumans, the world's greatest detective, not to mention one of the most powerful supervillains in the entire DC universe.
Whoa, slow down, egghead.
Obviously though, it's not the final iteration, because apparently there's 12 versions still out there which are going to be released in upcoming DLC. Until that stuff comes out though, well, I don't know, I guess you can grind for more Promethium and complete all the side missions with your buddies. You know, assuming you've still got any left. Bitch.
Congratulations, Task Force X. That was the kind of extreme high-risk operation you were made for.
At the end of the day, Suicide Squad isn't quite the dumpster fire that some people are going to make it out to be. But having said that, like, they still could have done a hell of a lot better than what we've gotten. Some very talented people have worked on how some of these characters look, and it does have some genuine moments of levity throughout the campaign.
They're in my size.
But then it also has some of the absolute messiest combat I think I've ever seen, and just a whole bunch of repetitive, boring, and uninspired missions. All of which comes at the expense of killing off some of DC's most beloved characters. I mean, look man, I'm not even a huge comics guy, and the way some of these people get treated pissed even me off. And I can't even imagine how some of the real nerds are going to be feeling.
All of them.
All I can say is Batman deserved better. We all deserved better. But you know what? It at least let me leap tall buildings in a single bound as a 7-foot tall man shark. So, I don't know, I guess it wasn't a total write-off.
Surf's up. Because you are Australian.